Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first listening session of the K12 Climate Action initiative of the Aspen Institute. Today's topic is going to be why should schools move toward climate action? We appreciate everyone joining the commission for this listening session, and we look forward to the insights that our panelists will share. Our goal in the work of the commission is to move the education sector toward climate action. That means thinking about how classroom learning experiences can prepare students to grapple with the consequences of climate change, how classroom learning experiences can prepare students to be a part of mitigation efforts, and also reducing our reliance on carbon and increasing the use of renewable energy. But moving the education sector to climate action also means addressing key infrastructure questions, from how our school buildings are designed to the kind of buses that we use, to how we handle food distribution and what happens to food in schools that isn't used. So lots of important questions on the role that schools can play in addressing climate change. We're excited to have all of you join us. And now I'll turn it over to Governor Whitman.
Well, thank you, Secretary King, and thank you to all of you who are on the panel and our commissioners and all those who are listening. This is an important topic and an important time to be talking about it. We are leaving this generation with a huge problem because no matter what we do now, we're not going to be able to stop the occurrences, and people need to start planning. And we've found over time that the best way to influence adults is through their kids, and to start teaching children in an early age the importance of understanding the climate, the environment around them, and to understand the impact that humans have in interacting with it is a wonderful way to finally bring them up with this being just part of their DNA, which it really has to be if we are going to solve the problem of climate change. But it's going to be on their backs. We don't want to scare them. So starting them early, helping them to understand their relationship to nature, helping them to understand how they can influence now, even as young people without the vote, how they can influence what goes on, what their parents are thinking, and what they should be thinking, and get them smart so that they can make the kinds of decisions that unfortunately so many going before them have not made. And the reason that we have to have this now. So I'm delighted to be part of this. I'm delighted that people are participating in the way they have, and I thank the Aspen Institute for pulling it together. Secretary King, I'll turn it back to you to do the first of the introductions.
Thanks so much, Governor. So this listening session today is the first in a series of listening sessions we will do to learn from experts about these issues. We have an outstanding panel joining us today. They will each present, and then we will have an opportunity for questions from the members of the commission. So today I'll introduce two of our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to the governor to introduce the other two panelists. We're joined by Bernstein, who's the interim director of the Center for Climate Health and the Global Environment at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Bernstein is a pediatrician at Boston Children's Hospital, and also an assistant professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. He also serves as the board chair of the U.S. Green Building Council. And we're thrilled to have Dr. Bernstein's insights today. And then we are very fortunate to have Maya Greene, who is a freshman at Stanford University and an organizing coordinator with Student Voice. This past spring, Maya graduated from Charleston County School of the Arts, where she was student body president. And Linda Darling-Hammond, who's on the commission, and I will have the pleasure of joining Maya's election 2020 class this evening at Stanford. So we're going to spend a lot of time today with Maya, and we're looking forward to hearing Maya's insights on climate change in schools. Governor Whitman?
We also have on the panel Nicole Berg, who is a climate change and climate justice programs manager in the Portland Public Schools. In this role, she's responsible for coordinating the development of a K-12 climate literacy curriculum across the district. And I'm also delighted to be able to introduce my home state's First Lady, Tammy Snyder-Murphy, who served as First Lady since her husband's election and taking office in 2018, And since the very beginning, at that time, she was focusing on climate change education. And she's helped make New Jersey, not for the first time, but the first state, one of the first states to offer climate change standards across our school curriculums. And I thank her for that leadership very much. And now we're going to start with Dr. Bernstein.
Thank you so much, Governor Whitman and Secretary King, and thanks to everyone at the Aspen Institute and Lauren Shifter in particular. And it's a great honor to have the opportunity to talk about something I spend a fair amount of time thinking about and to learn, as I know we all will, from my fellow panelists who have, some very, I think, important perspectives on these issues. I think from where I sit, so as you heard, I'm a pediatrician. I spend a lot of time thinking about climate change and health, and I also serve on the board of directors of the U.S. Green Building Council. And so the interface of schools and children and health is an interface that I spend a lot of time on. And I couldn't be more delighted in that respect to know about this conversation because as Governor Whitman was saying so clearly, we're delivering something to our children that they don't have a lot of choice in. And we have a real opportunity to shape their perception and their understanding of a way that will empower them rather than deflate them. And I have already spent time in classrooms in Boston Public Schools, down to the third grade, where teachers are sort of independently figuring out how to grapple with this subject. And I think it is absolutely critical that we think together about how to do this right, because we can do this in a way that makes it so that we have, young people in the United States who are, who understand the severity of what we're dealing with, but also know that they have exactly the talents we need to know what we need to do. So the classroom piece of this is huge, and I could talk about that for a long time, and I've written about it, but they're real important objectives as far as what we can be teaching children at various ages. But the fundamental issue is that I think we have to make sure that they understand that this isn't their responsibility. It's not that something they caused, but we absolutely need their talents and their dedication, and to show them the avenues to the solutions we can see before us. Then, of course, there's the very important reality that climate change absolutely matters to their health. And that's true outside schools, but it's particularly true within schools. You heard from Secretary King just a broad scope of things that schools are already thinking about: how children are transported, the kinds of foods they're eating, certainly the built environment. And let me just touch on a few things there to really get at what I mean. So school buses historically were diesel powered. Almost all school buses ran on diesel fuel. Diesel fuel is one of the worst fuels to combust in terms of air pollution. And so children, certainly who have asthma, are more likely to have asthma when they're exposed to diesel fuel. But it's not just that, folks. Children and teachers who are exposed to diesel fuel, who are exposed to the combustion of fuel oil in schools and other, wood burning stoves, are more likely to get respiratory infections. So we're in the moment of COVID, we talk about ventilation and how important that is, but we forget that some of the fuels we use to burn are actually strongly associated with respiratory infections. And that probably includes, the data we have on coronavirus is limited, but it certainly seems from the data we have that in adults, more long-term exposure to air pollution is contributing to excess mortality. And so by reducing reliance on diesel fuels, on fuel oils, and moving to renewables as best we can, actually can affect, risk of absenteeism, and for children who have severe diseases, hospitalization. Food. So school lunches, I know, are an enormously difficult subject, but I think it's important to recognize that, foods have very different carbon footprints, and that, one of the best programs I've seen at schools, which I recognize has a limited potential to actually providing food to children, but is enormously educational and also benefits the long term, are school gardens. Having children outside working in nature, understanding what it takes to actually grow food, seeing it fail before their eyes, it is an enormously powerful learning experience about how important it is to have the right climate, about how healthy food can be grown. And a lot of schools have actually gone one step beyond, which is that whatever is harvested, the students actually learn to prepare. Because we've learned that in the obesity epidemic, it's not simply enough to just get people access to affordable, healthy foods. It's the preparation of those foods. And in Boston, we have, I think, a wonderful private nonprofit partnership called Daily Table, which was founded by the former director of Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, where they not only take advantage of the absurdity of U.S. food labeling laws to take perfectly good produce and packaged goods that are near expiration or don't look exactly perfect, prepare them into meals and serve them at a fraction of the cost as would otherwise be possible. And then they take kids from the Boston Public Schools, bring them into the store, and they have a teaching kitchen so the students learn how to prepare foods and they bring those things home. And so just a wonderful, innovative example. It harnesses the talents of school children in Boston Public Schools, takes advantage of the reality that many nutritious, perfectly healthy pieces of produce don't look like they're, on a shelf made of plastic. And then, of course, with food in schools, we have a tremendous issue with food waste. So in the Boston Public Schools, I've worked with teachers say, well, what can we do in our school? And I said, well, let's take one issue. Turns out in the United States, food waste is a huge problem for carbon. It's a huge problem for water. And I think by raising awareness in schools and students recognizing that, there are issues with food waste and nutrition. There are issues with food waste and carbon and water. So there's another opportunity there. And then in the last point I'll make around the built environment, I'll just put this on temperature because that is the clearest relevance to climate change that we see. Is it's clear, very clear that the climate has already changed and it's getting hotter. Students and teachers who perform under heat perform worse. And that is well established now. And cooling off the environment in buildings is a huge challenge. And the solution is not necessarily air conditioning. The solution, frankly, should be green space and green roofs as a first pass. And that's not only because it cools down buildings, but green space around schools, there's some evidence that suggests that can, in fact, improve student performance. It certainly improves a whole host of other things like air pollution. Green space can sequester carbon on a school-wide scale. That's obviously not going to make a difference. But cooling is a huge deal for schools. Green roofs have been shown to not only lower summertime cooling loads, but also to decrease wintertime heating bills because they in fact act as a layer of insulation. There's obviously teaching opportunities. So the solution spaces around climate are fantastic for education. They're cost effective, and I didn't even talk about renewables and solar programs at schools that have an ROI that save on energy costs. They can improve the health and performance of students. They can benefit the welfare of staff at the school. And I think one final point is that many of these solutions, if not all of them, disproportionately benefit the students who have been left behind. So we know that when it comes to air pollution exposure, Black children, Latinx children in the United States, poor children, disproportionately exposed, also less likely to get exposed to green space. And so these interventions, when they're successful and they actually do reduce students' exposure to pollution, increase their exposure to green space, et cetera, are going to benefit the kids who've been harmed by these things the most. So I'll stop there. I'm eager to hear from my fellow panelists and also to take questions. Thanks.
Hello, I'm a visual learner, and so I actually did prepare some slides to kind of illustrate the points I make. I am so honored to present to this commission, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So yes, I did prepare slides, and I will, I guess, start by just briefly providing context for my perspective. From 7th through 12th grade, I attended Charleston County School of the Arts, which is a magnet school in Charleston County, where I majored in creative writing and was able to embark on a senior thesis, which is pictured kind of in the bottom left corner, where I was able to publish a book of poetry and personal nonfiction exploring identity and heritage and race in the context of my family. Throughout high school, I participated in community organizing with an interfaith organization in my area called the Charleston Area Justice Ministry. I participated in political advocacy through a program at my local YWCA, She's Strong, that I helped to run, where I was able to speak at the Women's March in Charleston. That's in the upper right corner. And now I am a first-year student at Stanford University, starting virtually due to circumstances. Not quite sure what I'm going to major in, but feeling fairly confident that I'll minor in education. So that is a real passion of mine. I am born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, which is obviously a very naturally beautiful place. Grew up, frequenting our beaches and estuaries. And, it's obviously just like a really great place to grow up. Definitely developed an appreciation for the natural world. I guess those are the benefits of my growing up on the coast. The drawbacks are that like with increasing frequency over my lifetime, even I've noticed, the hurricane evacuations that come year after year. I actually went through my Google Photos and pulled screenshots of times that my family evacuated, screenshots I took of news articles, Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Dorian, Hurricane Joaquin. It's just year after year with increasing frequency, I've lived, I guess, the worsening climate crisis. And so that definitely kind of influenced my passion for taking climate action. But the school system has not really provided much of a space, I guess, for that. I took AP Biology my junior year of high school. I took AP Environmental Science my senior year of high school. Both of those curriculums were very enlightening, but because they were national curriculums, I didn't really get to address what climate change looked like in my neighborhood. I learned the science behind it, but I was not really given a space to kind of examine and problem solve on a local level. And so I turned to writing, and through Student Voice, an organization I now work for, I was in a journalism fellowship my junior year of high school, and I was able to kind of process the ways in which South Carolina's environmental and social crises kind of intersect, realizing that, systemic racism is not mutually exclusive from environmental crises. And that was like a very good space for me to kind of address what climate action could and should look like. However, that doesn't negate the fact that schools could and should address this. The climate activist Jamie Margolin has this quote that I really like, this idea that for Gen Z, climate change is like Beyonce. Obviously you weren't born knowing about it, but just growing up, it's like something that is so pervasive that you just, you know what it is. I don't remember when I first learned what climate change was, but I do remember I first being introduced to the idea of carbon dioxide proliferating in the atmosphere. And I made a recreation of the solution I thought of when I got home from this conversation of a car that has a plant instead of an engine and produces oxygen instead of carbon dioxide. I couldn't have been older than 10 when I had this idea, which I think just goes to show that like the earlier you introduce kids and students to climate change, their innate desire is to problem solve around it. And I think that it's really important that we equip students as problem solvers for climate change due to the phenomenon of eco-anxiety, which has been defined by the APA as a chronic fear of environmental doom. I've seen this phenomenon in my little sister, who's currently 12. This is a quote by her: "I'm too young to do anything of big importance, so it just eats away at me." And it's definitely a pervasive phenomenon in Gen Z of just like this world that's falling apart around us. As we grow up, we experience it, and yet we're not really equipped in school to address it. And so I think that just kind of frames the problem and illustrates why schools are equipped to, take climate action. And so here, I guess I want to provide some context on the organization I now work for, Student Voice, which is a by student for student nonprofit that seeks to equip students as storytellers, organizers, and institutional partners. A lot of the way we frame the problem in education is that schools are civic institutions, the first civic institutions that students interact with, and yet they don't really equip students to address the political and social and environmental problems that students are so aware of. They don't provide the support and scaffolding for students to start, brainstorming solutions. That historically marginalized students often where students are consulted, historically marginalized students are often left out. And so we believe students have the right to these, this Bill of Rights that I won't get into, but I think that climate action certainly falls along, influenced decisions, deeper learning, positive school climate, like all of these things are things that intersect with climate action. So I think that kind of illustrates why schools, but then the more complicated question is how schools. And so I wanted to very briefly touch on service learning, which I think is an incredibly effective method for engaging students on climate change. I'm taking a class right now called Sustainable Cities with Deland Chan, who's an incredible professor at Stanford, where I'm working with a nonprofit in the Bay Area to monitor air quality science and provide outreach materials for the community to engage with air quality. I think, service learning could look like that. Service learning could look like the community gardens that Dr. Bernstein previously, kind of illustrated. And there's numerous benefits to providing students with an action pathway that helps them feel in control and like, climate change is a problem that they can solve because it's a problem they'll have to solve. So yeah, I'll stop there, but hope to elaborate in the question session.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just such an honor to be here to speak about the great work. What an honor to be with so many different panelists with amazing viewpoints as well. So I hope that the information that I offer will continue to complement the conversation and give you all some context about how we're working to operationalize this in the Portland Public School District in Portland, Oregon. As you can see, my name is Nicole Berg, and I am the Climate Change and Climate Justice Programs Manager in Portland Public Schools. I'm new to Portland, Oregon. I'm new to the Pacific Northwest. I'll give you some context as well about my life and background and how I came to this work. I'm originally from the Midwest, born and raised in Madison, Wisconsin. And the way that I came to this work is kind of a little bit of a non-traditional route. I grew up white presenting, Latina. My great-grandparents immigrated here from Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. And growing up with them very closely in my extended family, I became very curious about our history and our culture. Our language had been kind of suppressed because of assimilation. My grandparents had really promoted the idea of being Americans, and that meant we speak English and we just kind of follow the assimilation route. But I was always curious about how could I learn Spanish and how can I learn a little bit more about how we got here and what's it like to, for other Mexican American people in the US. And so unfortunately, I didn't access that kind of learning in my public school either. It was very Eurocentric. I did learn Spanish as a second language, as a world language. So I'm proud to say that I'm bilingual now. As a career path, I had initially wanted to get involved in justice efforts for immigrants. And I wanted to work in the field of immigration policy and specifically in international relations as it relates to the United States and Mexico. And through some soul searching and some life opportunities, I decided that I wasn't exactly excited about the idea of working within systems that I didn't appreciate. I didn't agree with certain ways that the laws are written. And so I thought, well, would I rather work within laws that I think are unjust, or would I rather try to transform the system and take a different path to work with immigrant youth? And I found my way to the public school system and discovered that I have a huge passion for working with youth. And I want to empower youth, and I want to amplify their voices as problem solvers and as critical thinkers, and also as the future leaders and innovators that we know them to be. And so I kind of worked in multiple different ways in the public school system as a bilingual educator. And as you can imagine, when you're working with underserved and marginalized youth and in a institution that marginalizes bilingual programming, it's hard to be a bilingual educator in a monolingual system. There are a lot of barriers that we continue to encounter, and not the least of which was systemic racism and language politics, and again, the pressure for assimilation and deficit viewpoints around what our bilingual learners were capable of doing. And so I spent a lot of time really helping the students share their voices so that they could create a picture and a new narrative for the educators that were serving them. And as also part of my own professional learning, I had to write a lot of curriculum because there's not a lot of bilingual curriculum out there that's of high quality and authentically representative of our students in classrooms. So I would seek out grant opportunities to travel around the world. And I would bring this learning back and try to replicate this experience for our youth around this idea of taking them on virtual field trips. And that was a lot harder to do back in the early 2000s with not a lot of technology, mid 2000s, but things are so much easier now with Google Earth and better technology to do these sorts of things. So I'm excited to continue that work in curriculum development with youth. But so I study a lot of humans. I studied in Mexico, I studied in Mesa Verde, I studied in the Badlands in South Dakota, and I'm curious about how did people organize themselves, what decisions did they make, and then how did sustainability impact their ability to thrive in a given location, and why did certain civilizations reconfigure themselves as a result of certain catastrophes or overuse of their environment. And climate change as an organizing topic hadn't really occurred to me until recently, actually in the last 5 years, when I participated in the National Geographic Grosvenor Teacher Fellowship, where I traveled to Antarctica and by way of South America. So we got 2 continents in one. But in Antarctica, we were able to learn about just the human impact on this environment. And I think one of the things that I'd love to continue to have people take away is that it's important that these environments, this concept seems so abstract, it seems so large, it seems so difficult to tackle. And some of the strategies that I was able to use when I came back home to share about Antarctica and to get students involved and interested in the topic was to pick something that they could relate to, or that they could empathize with, or they could get emotionally kind of attached to. So we started working with elementary youth on penguin units, talking to them about penguins, getting them involved in like acting out what the life of a penguin looks like, those sorts of things like life cycles and their habitats. And once the students were interested in that, we were able to talk about greater issues about threats to penguin populations and how do penguins and other animals live in Antarctica and those sorts of things. So we started to expand their world a little bit more and then start to connect it back to home. So what are some of the animals in our environment, and what are some things that are impacting our environment locally? So fast forward a little bit. In 2019, just last year, Portland Public Schools students had been on a series of rallies over the past 3 years. I'm hoping I didn't just freeze. Had been on a series of rallies from 2016 to 2019. There's a lot of youth climate activism going on in Portland Public Schools, organizing to address the climate crisis and say that we want access to the learning opportunities that will support us in becoming the change makers of the future. And just last year, they created a position, the school board allocated a position to coordinate those efforts because it was not happening as quickly as it needed to happen. And so that's how I ended up in Portland, as I saw the job and thought, wow, this is amazing. It's curriculum development, it's youth leadership development. It matters. And this topic has implications for the world. It has implications for our futures. And so I just have to be a part of this. And so fortunately, I was hired at Portland Public Schools to start this effort. And what we've done so far has been, we've developed a plan for curriculum integration across K12 units of study, anchored in standards, academic standards, and aligned to rigorous curriculum design with opportunities for project-based learning and community engagement as well. So there's an entire plan developed for how we're going to do this and which units will become the climate change and climate justice units. And this summer, we were able to develop an innovative transdisciplinary high school elective course that integrates science and social studies standards and also embeds English language arts. And it was actually created by a team of high school students with high school teachers together. And not just high school teachers from like a science teacher, but we also involved social studies teachers, and we also involved a special educator and educators teaching in alternative locations, alternative high schools. And so we were able to walk away with a very robust and project-based learning, inquiry-focused course that is piloting right now in our schools, and we're excited to continue that. And we're also excited to continue working on the youth. We have a youth advisory, a climate justice youth advisory that we will be working on as well. And it should be launching very, very soon, working with youth to plan that as well. And so it's just sort of a bird's eye view about what we're doing in Portland. And I welcome any questions you have. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It is such a tremendous opportunity to be part of this important conversation around climate science and our role in resolving it. Secretary King, Governor Whitman, great to be here with both of you as well as my fellow panelists. I am really grateful to the Aspen Institute's dedication to conservation and their belief in the power of education. Nelson Mandela once said that education is the most powerful weapon that we can use to change the world. In New Jersey, I would say that is a sentiment in which we wholeheartedly believe. Further, this generation of students is inspired and determined to fix the climate crisis. Ask any teacher and he or she will tell you a motivated student can achieve absolutely anything. These are the reasons why, despite New Jersey's warming at a rate faster than almost any other state, despite our disappearing shorelines, torrential downpours, and blazing hot summers, despite even the projected $10 billion climate change will cost the state of New Jersey, I'm optimistic. For decades, the debate around climate change has continued without much significant progress, but I think things are finally starting to change. I'm proud to say that this past June, New Jersey's educational system became the first public school system in the United States to admit that climate change is real. It's a tangible problem that this generation of children will be required to face, and further, that is our duty to prepare them for that certain future. By including climate change education across all core subjects from kindergarten through high school graduation, every New Jersey student will be prepared to explore, imagine, and advocate for the innovative solutions needed in communities in which they live. And as is often the case, New Jersey's incredible public school teachers will be at the crux of this important initiative. New Jerseyans value a commitment to academic rigor and the pursuit of knowledge. We believe in the power that education holds to change the course of a person's life. And we know that our educational professionals do more than just educate. They teach our students to be good citizens. It's no surprise then that New Jersey's educators have responded to the addition of climate change education standards with their characteristic enthusiasm and passion. They recognize just how important this is, but as with any new requirement, they are searching for the best ways to incorporate it. Our collective mission, resolving the damage that human activity has done to the environment since the 19th century, is an incredible burden that our children and grandchildren will have to face. But the adoption of these standards is much more than an added educational requirement. It's really a symbol of a partnership between generations. And together, we will begin to undo the damage we have caused. So how did we begin this undertaking? First, we were lucky enough to have a bit of fortuitous timing. In New Jersey, our learning standards are reviewed every 5 years by the Standards Review Committee. This committee is comprised of more than 130 educators from across the state who are selected to serve based on their experience and background. In March of 2019, the Standards Review Committee began updating New Jersey's state education standards. I first brought the idea of including climate change education to the committee at their opening meeting and continued to advocate for it at each subcommittee meeting throughout the year. I was incredibly impressed, inspired, and encouraged at the level of creativity our educators brought to shaping these standards. It's not an easy task to set a standard of education for a kindergartner on a subject as complex as climate change, or to imagine how this topic might fit into performing arts, but they all did it flawlessly. I really can't stress enough how much respect and admiration I hold for New Jersey's educators, and I'm very eager to see this come to fruition in our classrooms in the 2021-22 school year. New Jersey is on its way to achieving 100% clean energy by 2050. And I have no doubt that with our best in the nation public school system, our students will be well equipped to take on the future green economy as artists, entrepreneurs, city planners, insurance brokers, and more. And as I mentioned earlier, this generation of students is already motivated to act on this issue. And for our students in environmental justice communities, as Dr. Bernstein referenced earlier, who suffer much more deeply the effects of air pollution, the climate crisis is even more personal. Climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a social justice and equity issue as well. This will be an important part of the conversation as our children grow and become the future leaders and policymakers of this world. We are handing them a real problem that has perhaps already affected their health and will certainly continue to affect every aspect of their lives. If we don't educate them and give them the tools they need to understand the dangers of climate change and how to combat it, no matter what career they pursue, then I believe we are borderline negligent. I could not be more thrilled that our updated education standards are beginning to receive national attention, not only because I'm incredibly proud that New Jersey was first in this endeavor, but also because I can't wait to see who will be next. Nicole, maybe you'll bring it in from Portland, or maybe Maya's little sister will bring it in from Charleston. I'm not sure, I'm waiting to see. Either way, it brings me again to my gratitude for this opportunity to be a part of this panel today. I look forward to our discussion and to partnering in our shared mission to make our children inherit an earth that has all the beauty and resources that we were fortunate enough to experience ourselves. Thank you.
Just start by saying thank you to our chairs for putting together, and our staff for putting together such an incredible lineup of panelists. I could have listened to them all day. So I thank you all for doing that, and thank you to our panelists. I'm going to throw my first question to Maya. I know I'll just get one at a time, so I'll just start with Maya. But Maya, I really actually want to put up start with where First Lady Murphy ended, and that is when she talked about this is a social, I would add, racial justice equity issue. Can you talk a little bit about, given what you share with us in terms of your background and what you're passionate about, and your you articulating so well the connection between this crisis and racial and social justice? Can you talk a little bit more about how you envision and can guide us as educators, and me as a union leader too, steeped in committed to racial justice in education? Can you talk to me a little bit about how you could envision this work, from the beginning, because being centered in racial and social justice, because too often at the end we think about that impact, but how would you envision centering the work from the beginning in racial justice?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's an incredible one, and like an incredibly important one too. I think, yes, it can't be an afterthought in the same way that diversity, equity, and inclusion can't be an afterthought or something you tack on at the beginning. It has to be interwoven because the issues are so intersecting. And so I think in terms of integrating it from the racial equity and climate action from the very beginning, I think in terms of how that looks in the classroom, they're absolutely related because my background where I was able to embark on this kind of self-directed journey my senior year to like really investigate my family's heritage and what race means, and especially in the historical context of growing up in Charleston, South Carolina. That really illustrated me illustrated to me the importance of culturally relevant education. And I think that culturally relevant education often looks like the project-based learning that Nicole spoke of, or the service learning that I spoke of, and that when you are really guiding students on kind of figuring out where they fit in climate action and figuring out where their lived experiences, students are always asking why. So, maybe, starting with their lived experience and letting them investigate that, and letting them investigate the way their identity colors their perception of that, and how, that intersects with like the larger global issue of climate. I think students will make the connections if the space is given for them to make the connections, and if they're really encouraged to value their story and bring their identities and their experiences and their heritage and their, if they're in, the school educates the whole person. And if that is encouraged in the classroom, then racial equity and climate action absolutely will go hand in hand.
My name is Lisa Hoyos, and I am just about to start National Climate Strategy Director at the League of Conservation Voters, but I co-founded Climate Parents, which is an important hat, why I'm a commissioner. And I wanted to ask Dr. Bernstein, I am really impressed about the work Sea Change is doing, and I'm very familiar with the work the U.S. Green Building Council is doing, particularly their Center for Green Schools, because when I was running Sierra Club's Climate Parents program, we were pushing for 100% clean energy school districts. So my question, how do you see the intersection of the research findings you're finding, the policy prescriptions generated out of both institutions you help lead and shape, and what is the nexus to actually shaping state policy and national policy if we get the change we're hoping for soon?
How much time do you have? It's such a great question, Lisa. The Sea Change, the Center at Harvard, is really intended to put science into action. Like that, we do our own research. Obviously, we rely on research, not just from Harvard, but around the world. But we're really trying to interface with practitioners to make sure it's science. And so, when it comes to educational settings, I think you heard it loud and clear from my fellow panelists. I mean, the amazing thing about climate actions is that they're exactly the things we should be doing anyway. I mean, hearing Maya talk, we need to really think about how, children are probably in many ways learning better when they have these experiential learning, these authentic learning environments. And when it comes to the, sure, there's research showing, like I was talking about, the heat effects and the ventilation effects and the air pollution, all this stuff. These are things we need to do as a society regardless. And they, these are fundamentally anti-racist actions as well. So I think the more research we do, it just gives us more motivation to do what we know we need to do. And in many ways, I think the rubber hits the road around finances, right? So school districts in particular are not cash-rich enterprises. And so when you think about things like green roofs, school gardens, getting students out of the classroom into the communities all cost money. And on the one hand, anyone on this call would recognize the absurdly small amount we spend on education versus other things in the United States. And as a pediatrician, I would say, we need to put more money where our mouth is in terms of children's welfare. But presuming our budgets are finite, there are a lot of these things that are actually return on investments. And I mentioned green roofs as one very good example. But there are others as well. I mean, there's a very innovative, I mentioned some of the food innovative solutions. They're really innovative nonprofits that start around solarization school districts. And these things save money, which can be redirected to the kinds of programs we need, and that's internal to the school district. So you could come to me to get your justification. I mean, I'm happy to tell you about how, here's one data point for you. So in a study of this is a former doctoral student of mine who's now a professor at UCLA, Ji-Sung's Park's work. He got a hold of 4.5 million test scores in the New York Regents exam. And looked at whether you took that exam on a 90-degree day versus a 72-degree day. the difference in performance on that one exam, and for those of you know in New York State, this is like the epitome of the high stakes exam. It determines whether you're able to progress in school, and there was a 13% difference, which was a quarter of the achievement gap between Black American children and white children in the New York public schools, based upon the temperature. And what's really critical about that finding, it's not just on that 1 year, that students who took the test on a hot day and were exposed to higher temperatures had a much higher chance of failing out of school, not progressing over the long term, which sets up potentially lifelong, from one test, a potentially lifelong effect. So think if we could actually get those schools appropriately climate controlled, we could save on energy bills, we could address racial disparities in education, and all we need is a revolving loan fund. That's all we need. And so, these are the kinds of things where, yes, we should be doing this because students deserve to perform their best on exam day. We should be doing them to prevent the fossil fuels that would have to be burned to make that energy that are polluting the environments of the poor children, particularly children of color, particularly Black American children. We know the data are very clear in the United States. Black Americans and Latinx Americans bear the disproportionate amount of outdoor air pollution, and they're the least responsible for it. So, that's what the research tells us, that these things are critical for energy and cost. They're critical for student performance and teacher performance, and they're going to prevent harms. And so thanks for the question. But I would love to provide anyone who's on this webinar the scientific ammunition to go to folks and say, here's the return on investment. Here's why this matters to student performance. Here's why this is going to matter not just for this one test, but across the entire potential educational career of this student.
Hey everyone, my name's Nana. I joined a bit late, for which I'm sorry, but I'm a high school senior from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I directed this question in the chat towards First Lady Murphy, but actually would love to hear insights from First Lady Murphy or from Nicole, because the two of you have had these roles in really putting climate curriculum into the classrooms of public schools. I'm a public school kid. I've gone to public school my whole life. And my teachers and my administrators have always been amazing about including anti-oppressive, anti-racist curriculum and even some climate curriculum. But I've also seen a lot of pushback from parents and families who maybe don't believe that those things are issues that should be talked about in public schools, or maybe are just concerned about the social and emotional well-being of their children, especially younger children, with regard to these, serious topics. And I'm wondering from the two of you, did you ever have to deal with parents or families or even advocacy groups who were very opposed to the implementation of this kind of curriculum in the districts that you have worked with? And if so, not only how did you overcome that, but were there ways that you found success in bringing them in and not just overcoming them as a barrier, but bringing them into the climate fight and showing them why this is important?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And I would say that, yes, there definitely was pushback across New Jersey, but there's pushback everywhere. I'm a founding member of Al Gore's Environmental Board, and I have been hearing this out in the stratosphere for a long time. But, I think by and large, our educators are looking at the data, and they are very interested in teaching to that data. I think that another area of pushback, which perhaps is relevant here, is that a lot of people are concerned that, or there was a lot of concern expressed that perhaps this is too daunting of a curriculum to bring to young students. And my answer would be, it's a little bit like putting your head in the sand. If you know that it's daunting, then the best thing you can do to equip the future generations is to teach them and make sure that everyone is climate literate. I know that Nicole said that in her remarks, and truly, it's so important. It's like saying that you're going to teach a kindergartner geometry. You're not. You're going to start teaching them to add and subtract. So you're going to teach them very basic vocabulary as we start out, and it will be age appropriate. And as we move forward, you build on that. But I think by and large, the most important thing that you can do is to encourage people to reach out and lock arms together, whether it's educators, whether it's legislators, advocates. Everybody has to be on the same page and really want this change to come about, because, you know, the world is moving towards a green economy. New Jersey has said we're going to be 100% green by the year 2050. There's going to be new jobs opening up. There's going to be a new conversation. And we don't just need scientists and engineers. We need people who can communicate. We need people who can share and think through all of the new challenges of the future. I will tell you that Climate Reality Project which is Al Gore's environmental board, has a website that's called climaterealityproject.org/act/schools. And they have a way on that website for you to be able to log in and to easily send your Department of Education letters and explain why you want to do this. So I would suggest you try and mobilize a group of people around that and try and get them to help you. Thank you.
The same holds true for Portland, Oregon as well. We do have, fortunately, a strong base of support locally in the community where there's climate action taking place at different levels of our government, and different policies are being implemented across Portland. And I think the way that we have been able to strategically develop the curriculum and plan for the curriculum development in such a way that it really does take into consideration that, just like racial justice, just like when we embed racial equity, social justice themes into our classrooms, we also need to be mindful of the fact that every single person in our space has their own racial narrative, whatever that is. And so it's part of our job to create the conditions through, orienting to conversations around how do we engage in difficult topics? How do we engage in politically contentious topics in such a way where we're being respectful of each other and listening to understand? So a lot of it falls on the way that an educator organizes and sets up their classroom community. And so we were very intentional for our high school elective in particular. We were very intentional about creating a launch unit wherein we took a lot of standards from the teaching tolerance framework to orient students to this work and how to talk with each other and how to engage in these conversations respectfully, because we will all have very different opinions and ideas. And it's our job to collaboratively come up with solutions, or to come up with our own thoughts around how to solve this crisis. If we could have solved this crisis with one arrow, we would have done it. So we need to engage students in inquiry and different lines of questioning and reasoning. And again, as First Lady Murphy said, the gradual progression and making sure that our conversations are developmentally appropriate. I did pull up we anchored on ethnic study standards as well in some of our units. And so here's a kindergarten ethnic study standard is all about identifying examples of unfairness or injustice towards individuals or groups, and the change makers who work to make the world better. And so we can start as early as kindergarten talking about, who are people that make a difference in our community? What are the differences that need to be made in our community? And we can engage in conversations around that and anchoring on students' lived experiences. And then we might, in high school, then start up talking about evaluating options for individual and collective action to address local, regional, and global problems by engaging in self-reflection, strategy identification, and complex causal reasoning. And so there's that progression across the K-12 experience that helps students just sort of, again, dig into what is it they're curious about, and also then how do we have these conversations, and how do we communicate that learning to the greater community?
Maya, I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia, the other Charleston, beautiful, but differently so. And I decided to first introduce myself. I'm sorry, I chair the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. About half of our grant making is in sustainable development. We also do a lot of democratic practice work. So of course I'm gonna ask a question about civic engagement, which is in Charleston, West Virginia, we did not even learn evolution, much less climate change. It's the heart of coal country. And so I've seen different models for civic engagement. A term I first heard, by the way, I went to Stanford as well and decided to become a teacher through tutoring in East Palo Alto through the Haas Center. I've seen models where the teachers are the coaches for students doing civic engagement projects. And I've seen models where there are democracy coaches who come in from local colleges. I've seen nonprofits engage. It's a very specific question. I apologize for that. But who do you think would be the best type of supporter for this kind of work?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I think, honestly, and maybe this is not the most satisfying answer, but I do think it might vary depending on like the environment that the school is in and where the school is. I feel like education is such a place-based thing, and that, you know, climate action in Portland, you know, probably looks vastly different from climate action in Charleston. And so I think civic engagement is similar, where, you know, there's not one, you know, civic engagement expert that is like perfectly equipped to educate, you know, lead civic education in every school environment. And that, but that bringing in community activists, bringing in elected officials, really showing, understanding civic engagement as like basically just like taking action beyond yourself for your community and not narrowing it down to just voting in government, because I think it can look like a lot of different things. But then also, you know, teachers are absolutely equipped to kind of lead students on the exploration as well with thoughtful curriculum. So I think civic education will look different, and honestly, like a variety of ways to address civic education are probably necessary in every school.
My name is Kira O'Brien. I'm the founder and president of Young Conservatives for Carbon Dividends. Just graduated from Harvard this spring, and as the name suggests, a young conservative passionate about climate change. My question is for our first two speakers, I believe. You both spoke about how children fit into climate solutions, but I was wondering, how do we strike a balance between giving children the correct tools to seek solutions and kind of assuage fears without, well, like still maintaining that it's not their problem to solve? Like, I absolutely understand that children want to be inventive and tackle problems, and that's a wonderful energy to channel. But how do we do that without stressing them out inappropriately?
So thanks, Karen, and thank you. I followed your group at Harvard for some time, and I really am impressed. And as I'm sure you share, Ted Halstead's passing is just a tremendous loss for what I think is actually a terrific idea. And I'll throw out there that I, in fact, too, am a Stanford graduate, and I did work with the Haas Center and you know, touching some common touch points. But I also learned from Larry Goulder and John Taylor, who were conservatives who proposed in the first Bush administration a carbon tax. And John Taylor, of course, was an economic advisor to the second President Bush. This is not a new idea. And in fact, it goes back to the Reagan administration. But your question is one that I've actually talked directly with you know, psychiatrists. I actually work at with children with severe mental health conditions. And I've spent a lot of time talking to folks about this very question because it's critical. And I think the short of the answer is that we have to remember that responsible parenting and adulthood is giving a child the opportunity to explore and create the independent pathways that Maya so eloquently talked about, but remembering that the question is, what would you do about this? What would you choose to do? And being a parent and being responsible to that child and seeing how they respond, because the bottom line is that different children are more or less likely to go down the road of, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming and terrible. And that's when we need responsible adults to step in and say, you know, you didn't create this. So it's about the continuity of the relationship. And that's why the educational setting is so important. So in the Boston Public Schools, where I've been in like classrooms down to the second, third grade, you can't just have a single conversation about this. You have to have a conversation where the understanding is there's a continuity of support. And in the world, and as we understand it, of adverse childhood events, these, you know, things that happen in every child, and that could be exposure to something, you know, like gun violence in a community, or it could be to hurricanes and wildfires. And the single most important buffer against those things is an adult in that child's life, a grown-up in that child's life, who that child can turn to when the concern arises. So that to me is really the crux of it. We, you know, obviously we shouldn't go out there and say, here's the problem, you fix it. In the same way, we should never talk to, in my view, a person of color and say, we've got racism in this country, please, you fix it. we need to have the continuity of relationship, and we need to have educators who get that this issue of climate change in many ways has a lot of features that they're extremely well capable of dealing with already. It falls in this issue of exploring race in the classroom, exploring injustice, and keeping that constant vigilance about, this is a place where, as you so well put it, children can really go in a wrong place. I loved Maya's cartoon because children don't have the blinders we do. I have a lot of stories from my experience to talk about this, but because we haven't blinded them to the world, we haven't created these straitjacketed views, they think about cars that run on plants and exhaust. I mean, that sounds crazy, but people actually, in a legitimate way, look at that. They say, can we run cars on plants? But no, anyway, so I think there's a dual-edged sword here, right? There's a possibility of people getting really scared and afraid, which is preventable, but there's an enormous upside, and that's the part why it's so important to listen to young people about this issue. They give insights in ways that are just nothing that adults would ever think of, and they're incredibly valuable.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much to the panelists. It's a wonderful panel, and to all of you who are on YouTube streams. We're now going to be closing that out. And the panelists, if they want to join us, with the commissioners, are going to go into breakout. I trust everybody saw and heard from this panel the scope of what needs to be discussed, the nuances between how do you deal, well, the really two levels we have here. What can the schools themselves do physically? What can you do with the built environment? But then how do you teach children? How do you reach children? What's the best way to engage them so that we don't threaten them, but we give them tools so they can see how they can make a difference and how this can be managed if everybody will focus on it and start to work toward it. And there are all sorts of exciting ways to do that. And I know we're going to get into that in much greater depth as we go forward. And I really look forward to the discussions that are going to be occurring as we go forward this year and to the final report. But I hope everybody who was on the YouTube streams is encouraged by it, excited by it, and starts to do their own thinking and reach out to the panelists on their own and reach out to Aspen on their own. So thank you all very much.
Thanks. I'll just add my thanks to the panel and really appreciate the thoughtfulness of your responses. I'll recommend to our YouTube viewers that they check out the State Policy Landscape Report that the Aspen Institute staff prepared that really captures what's going on in states around engaging the education sector on climate action. Two last reflections. As a former social studies teacher, I'm so grateful for the way civic engagement was woven into the conversation by all of the panelists. And I'm also, as the parent of two high school students, two girls of color who are figuring out intersections between their identity, issues of climate change, issues of civic engagement. I really appreciated the thoughtful comments of the panelists around the socio-emotional dimensions of these issues, and really appreciated Becky raising how we center racial justice in these conversations, and Kira pushing us on how we make sure that young people feel empowered without feeling like we're passing the burden to them of solving this challenge. This is something that all of us need to work on intergenerationally. So thank you all again. Thank you to our YouTube viewers for joining us. And I look forward to the debrief discussions.